welcome everybody. We are going to do a fun presentation on clinical site payments. So I'll do a quick overview. So basically, in general, and I wanted to have this image with buildings on it because I was like, I think it would be the best image to transition to, like, what is a site, right? So clinical sites payments are typically from the sponsor who has the drug, right? So they make the drug in their labs, they test it out for multiple years. Now they have a solid product. They want to test it in people. So then they work with what we call the sites, which are the which I'm trying to represent with buildings here, that are the institutions. So that's like, let's say like Harvard or Stanford or whatever, Mayo Clinic, and those are the ones that actually run run the trial from the standpoint of they're the ones seeing the patients, whereas the sponsor, the company that is like basically paying for the study, and usually that you see them as they have oversight from the view of the FDA. They need to know what's going on, from making sure that everything goes well in the study, and they're in charge of paying and organizing all these different vendors, right? So there's different systems they pay for, but they also pay the patient, the sites who manage all the patients, and they pay them usually like per patient, and then also like startup fees and things like that. So that's something to think about, just kind of high level. Who are we talking about? We're talking about the sites paying, or the sponsor paying the sites, right? Now the doctors seeing the patients and testing out the medication. Sometimes you can have a CRO to handle that for you. And so that means that a CRO is your clinical research organization, which is this kind of like third party that kind of tries to help out, manage as much as they can of the study. But in general, they're not the responsible ones. The sponsor's responsible for it. So high level summary, and I will go into like some screenshots about what we have, but basically you get your invoice, and I'll show you an example, and then once you need to review it, and the idea is you can review it against multiple things. You might have a patient tracker, you might have you might go into a clinical system such as like your EDC metadata, looking to see, did this patient have this visit, right? So the invoice says, hi, this is Harvard. We saw these 3 patients. These are the different visits they had. Maybe these are the different labs they had. And now we want you to reimburse us, right? We did the work and we need to be reimbursed. So you cross-check the invoice against, is it expected? Does it make sense? You can also cross-check against your budget tracker in the sense of, have you already paid for this, right? So that then this happens. I think in general, when you're thinking about processing site payments, you don't want to assume malintent on the site side. You're not assuming that they're going to try to sneak in some extra money here and there, but they make mistakes all the time too. So you got to think about, that a lot of times they might by accidentally bill you for a visit that just happened, but it actually, they put it on the last invoice too, or something, so you gotta have to like watch out. Did you pay this last time? And so sometimes it's good to pull up your previous invoice just to make sure that it makes sense. Also, are they missing one? That can happen too, where they bill you, let's say, for visit 4, and then the next one you have a visit for visit 6, and you're like, oh, well, like, where's visit 5? So you can like make a little note to yourself. It could be like, because if they bill you later for 5, then it makes sense because you've never paid them for visit 5. So that's kind of the thing you want to do. You're checking it against different sources. And then the next thing you want to check, of course, is the contract, right? So what's interesting, and that's something that I kind of found that I thought was a little weird, was it's really the site that decides what they want to be paid. There's like negotiations that go back and forth, but there's many aspects to consider, right? Like the cost of living and things like that, in terms of like, how expensive it is for Harvard to see patients versus maybe a site like out in like the Midwest or something, right? The cost, what they pay their doctors, what it pays for the hospital to have their, whatever rent mortgage-esque thing on the land might be different. So the cost that you're paying is actually different per site, which I think is kind of annoying. It'd be a lot easier as a sponsor to be like, okay, this is what we pay per patient. But it basically, each and every site will go through negotiations and you will come up with a budget. And then you use that like contract, that budget. And then usually there's like a table within the contract that will say like how much per visit. And you check that to make sure that they're invoicing you for the right amount, right? So the first is making sure that they actually have that right patient and it's the right visit. And then the next thing is making sure it's the contract, the right kind of what they're charging you per item is correct. And then you usually use some sort of invoice system to update the, usually most places you don't do it manually. I'll kind of show you some screenshots of some manual. And then I'll show you at least one example of there's many different systems that they have right now for you to process payments. But sometimes it can be as simple as you, within your own company, basically your company decides usually how they process their payments. And then once you're done, you want to make sure that you update any sort of tracker you have, because you want to make sure that's easy for the next invoice. So okay, what you paid, did you pay, for what patient? So you have usually your own tracker. Now, again, if you have a very fancy system, then the system might help you with that. But typically you can have your own just Excel tracker. Oops, went too far. Okay, so I won't read everything, just like kind of like high level, like why is this important? So in general, it's really expensive to run clinical trials, right? It's a lot of money that goes into developing the drug, the medication, and then part of the aspect is recruiting the sites to join the clinical trial. So having them feel as though they're being paid appropriately is really important, right? So you don't want to negotiate all that hard. And I've seen situations where I've worked at, like, let's say a smaller company, and they would push really hard and say, we can only pay X amount, and they go back and forth. But then you have enrollment problems because of that. Because if they have a patient, so the doctor sees a patient and you're running, let's say, a lung cancer trial, and the guy is a lung cancer specialist, and so all of his patients he usually sees, have to do with lung cancer. And the idea is he sees a patient and he might be on 3 different studies. And he might say, okay, well, this one study is a very specific study and they're looking for, let's say, like younger, lung cancer patients. So I'm going to, this person fits that criteria. So I'm going to, because it's rare, I'm going to preference that study. And then, if it's another one, and let's say there's 2 that are kind of equal, realistically, they're not supposed to, but they might preface which one pays them more, right? They get paid per patient, per whatever, all these different things they're doing for the patient. So it can be annoying if you negotiate too hard. You think, oh yes, that's awesome, like we're saving money on this. But in the end, it might actually take you longer, which is actually more expensive for your trial, because there's a startup cost to establishing that site, and you want to get the most patients out of that site as possible. So by making sure that the invoices and you're paying on time, you're not messing up your site payments, everything's good, that can be a tool to keep the sites motivated. Okay, so kind of just high level of what I just said, it's an encouragement for enrollment, and then usually as the patient visits occur, you usually get invoiced. So maybe it's like a monthly is what I typically seen the invoices come in, and they'll come through and they say, okay, this is how many patients we saw and what visits per month. And so that's something how you want to have a quick turnaround, and you want to be accurate, and that helps them know that they're getting paid, especially when, for example, a site screening, right? So that's when a site is thinking about what patients to be a part of the trial. They're putting them in, and that's when it's basically like the most kind of work for them in a sense. And so they get paid per screening subjects, and so you want to keep them motivated. So making sure that you get those screening visits paid right away is just beneficial for everybody in a sense. Okay, and then like I mentioned, there's differences for cost, like material, where they are in the country, and then just basically, I don't know where to put this. But basically, so yeah, you just want to make sure that you're aware of everything, and you want to make things as easy as possible. So if sites have their own system for payments, you can utilize that, or you just want to make sure that everything is organized and just as easy for everybody across the line, especially when it comes to financials, because people are more concerned about that. So for example, maybe if you were not paying the bills and you weren't sending back the payments accurately, the site might say, hey, we're not going to enroll any more patients until we see that you are appropriately paying us, which would really mess up your study. So you wouldn't want to do that. Okay, so this is kind of a more exciting part. This is an example of an invoice. And so they might say where they're from, like which, this would be up here, would be like what site, their invoice number, and information on like the sponsor, and any sort of date and information. And then you would see like these ones that, for example, are 2 screen failures, right? So they have the date and they have the cost. And this also is an enjoyable part for me, because you get to see how much like the budgets are a lot for this. And so this is for 1 screen failure. So this person's not even in the study, and it's $2,000. So that's how much it's costing the sponsor. So to imagine that running a large study and you're going to have tons and tons of people who don't qualify and don't work for the study, and then tons of people who do, and then you have all their lab charges and everything going forward, it's quite adds a lot. So it makes sense that medicines in general tend to be expensive, and it's because it's expensive to run these studies. So that's why you take a look at the dates and make sure it makes sense. I'll show you some other examples of types of items, like line items that you would be expected to see. But again, you would want to look at like what it is, and then you go back to the contract and see, okay, does this amount make sense? So this is a sample budget, and I can pull this up if we have time at the end too. But basically this is where you would go in, and so you could see, let's say the last one was a screen fail, but if somebody was to come in, then you could say, okay, so the informed consent, their visit 1, they would have all of these items. So then you would know, okay, that's what I should be expecting. So sometimes you have to add up items, or sometimes they'll make the breakdown on the invoice. But you're just looking and you're checking to make sure that the cost is correct. And again, there's a good chance it's not correct. And that's why it's important to do this check, because like I said, each budget is different. And so for a different study, they might be charging $300 for the physical examination, right? And so there's a chance that they charge you $300 just because that's what they typed last time or something. And so a lot of times the error is not malicious, but errors are common, and so you have to just be careful. So they might misbill you for something, and ideally you want to catch that as soon as possible so that you can then have them send you an updated invoice and everything can get processed as soon as possible. Okay, so this is an example of a study budget tracker. So this is not the site's budget. That was more of what I just showed you before. This is now what would be your tracker. And so you could see, okay, here are the different patients. And so we had just seen a screen fail, right, on that invoice. And so this is an example where you would see the screen fail, and you could say, okay, this is what it costs, right? And it costs in February. And that's for 1 patient, right? And that's about what we saw. The other one, and there are 2 different studies and different things going on. The other one was 2,000, and here they're saying they're saying it's 1,700, right? So that kind of gives you a ballpark of what costs are. And the way this tracker is done by months, and you can see like whether or not they're active, or if they're now off treatment, which means like, let's say they were on the study in January, and then in February, maybe they had one visit, and that's why there's zeros across the board, because they're no longer being seen because they're off treatment. And so that kind of gives you a little high level of what you would expect to see on a tracker. And so ideally, after you pay your invoice, you would go back here and you would type in the amount of what you just paid, so that you can then keep totals of everything, right? And so here's, let's say, like, here's the total down here for everything for that site. And so you'd want to continue to have the budget so that you can know when are you running out of money. Like, let's say at the bottom of this table, you would have, summary trackers. So you can see, okay, what is your study budget? What are you expecting? And then that way, if you, for example, what I'm doing right now, I'm working on some contracts that aren't site related, but similar in the sense that, like, I'm having to track how much I'm spending per patient on this aspect. And initially it was way over. Like, it was our estimate was not well done, right? We ended up taking more time and costing more per patient. And yes, can site renegotiate the payment per visit? So they can renegotiate. And Nick, you can feel free to jump in on your experience on this. I found that it's typically pretty rare. And yeah, so like, if it's right now, like, inflation's gone up, right? So we've seen that where due to COVID and during different things, they've had to do different things. Like, the sites had to do different, right? They maybe had to hire extra people or things like that. So that's when they can say, hey, inflation, it's actually not the correct amount. We're going to need to be charging you more.
Yeah, I think usually it is not very frequent. It also depends on how long that site has been open. If it's a long trial, and let's say that patient's on the study for a year, I feel like it's a little bit, it can be more frequent depending on how long that contract's been in play for.
Yep, agreed, right? So if it's like a 6-year study and their budget is, really old, right? Then it's like, yes, inflation and things like that have taken into account, and now they're being paid the same amount, but it's not really fair because they're having to pay their nurses more and things like that. But yeah, I think that is something that I've only recently seen that in the last couple years. I rarely saw it prior to kind of like COVID and this like more recent inflation. But great question, Logan. All right, let's see. Okay, this is just another patient tracker. So you can kind of get ideas of which studies you're doing and which patients are active and things like that, right? So for example, if you have a withdrawn patient, you shouldn't see any more bills for them, right? So so that's something to see, where you do actually need to very carefully go back and look at the contracts and try to look at what you're being billed for, because you don't want to kind of be billed for something and be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, like, they have a patient 4, so they should have a patient 3. That sounds good, but you like didn't know that, let's say, patient 3 was withdrawn, and so there's no way that they had a recent MRI. Okay, and then this is not a fabulous image. This is an image from Oracle. And then I also found a cool video that I might send out afterwards on Viva has a site payments, and they have like a site payment like little tutorial on how they are trying to encourage people to use their system. So I thought it was kind of fun, but I was like, well, I don't really like want to play you a video. So, but we did find Oracle. Oracle's what I've typically used in different companies. And then right now working at Genentech, we use a more custom system. But basically you might have your visits. I know it's basically like pretty impossible to read, it's like blurry, but and you might have your dates, and you can kind of then, let's say, on a different screen, pull up your EDC system, right? And that's where the sites are entering in all of the details per the visit. So you go, no, okay, this visit did happen. okay, great. And then you can like, click on the invoice and you just go ahead and you approve it in the system. So that's the way my system works. The invoices that I get, you go in, you click a link, and you can kind of see the PDF, and you kind of click the approve button within the system, and then it gets routed to like procurement or whatever your like financial kind of department is called, and then they will issue payment. And sometimes it's as old school as them actually like cutting a check and sending it in the mail. But yeah, so that's the way it works. And usually sites usually like will PDF their invoice and send it in to like an email address that then gets routed and uploaded into the system. But this is just better for them to kind of organize, and you can kind of see different tracking and things like that within a actual system versus if you are just like manually tracking it in Excel. So I've done both, and I definitely like systems better. Okay, thanks everybody. Any questions? I can stop sharing. And yeah, I want to see what you have any thoughts on knowing what's going on at a site and how site payments are done.
I'm really curious so this feels like a role that would be a part of a CTA's responsibility. Like, how does this work as its own job? Like, how is there enough work there?
Yeah, so that's something that I think is a great question. Usually this is a part of the CTA role. So like, for example, Nick will most likely start doing this soon as he is a CTA, and if he goes into more of a senior role. But basically the role that Jesse's looking to apply for is at Genentech is just specifically on this. So for example, one of the studies that I'm a part of is a huge global study that's like in 37 countries. And so as a result, they're probably going to have like one person who's going to be in charge of just like paying. Sometimes you might do it like per country, right? You might have like a country rep, and they're in charge of a lot of different things from like site enrollment to site payments. Or it looks like the way they're organizing it is they're having somebody specifically for site payments. And that way, in a sense, it kind of can pay the position less versus somebody who's maybe higher up and doing more like site enrollment and more of like a CTM. Because sometimes this veers into like CTM realm. Usually a CTM is more on the negotiating the contract. So Genentech in general is like this big giant company. And while like, and I love this about it, but one negative that some people have is that sometimes what they do is they try to make it really efficient. So somebody's job is kind of almost repetitory, and you're just really focused, and you have this really small scope. And so it's like not as good in terms of like growth and learning, because you just do the one thing again and again and again. And so you get really good at it, and you're not being distracted by a whole bunch of things. So like from a company standpoint, you're more efficient. And so that's why I think Genentech has its own role. That's kind of like a CTA role, but it's like in between CTA and a CTM, but they're not going to pay you quite CTM level. Though the title that Jesse's going to go for is actually more of a CTM title, but it's the pay is definitely more of a CTA pay. So it's kind of interesting.
I mean, yeah, because like the job looked kind of fun, and anything that is akin to working Excel seems like a good time. So I was just really curious how that worked, but that makes sense.
Yeah, we'll have to let you know how Jesse does, and also like Logan, if you're interested, like click the link. I put it in the email out there. And a lot of times they have multiple roles.
I'm not trying to steal from Jesse, but it is giving me ideas to, because I've
Yeah.
been giving my boss has been asking me if I want to like help out with other functions, and this seems like potentially something I could like, I don't know, float out there as something I could help out with. Yeah, this just seems like an interesting.
Yeah, no, and I think it's cool because also, again, for me, it's in the realm of TMF where I kind of like the repetitory thing, where you're kind of doing the same things again and again, because it's like very comfortable to me, and it's like not super hard, and it's just kind of interesting, and like the role I'm in right now has a lot of aspects of that. Like I do a lot of like system, I do like user access and things like that. And it's kind of a very simple, like, oh, somebody wants access, I go check to make sure they're on the actual study, and then I grant them access, and then I have to like update my own little tracker, and so it's kind of an interesting flow of items. And so yeah, Logan, you should definitely look into it and get a little site payment experience under your belt. And then yeah, I can always keep you posted on any openings. And then yeah, Jesse says that there is a role also at BioMarin that's similar.
I'm good with applying for jobs for now, but
I know.
all for getting more experience.
Yes, yeah, get more experience. And then that's another reason why I think also, like, if people say they need help at work, like, learn a little bit more and try to volunteer for things, because then it leads you to better future career choice. I do think, Logan, in general, like, I think you might like more Excel oriented, like site payments, like site projections, even like project management aspects are all very like heavy on the Excel, and Logan is one of our Excel gurus. So I'm still trying to get him to do a round 2 of the Excel presentation.
I would say fanboy more than a guru, but
Yeah,
I appreciate
it. Yeah, any other questions? Nick, you've unmuted yourself.
I mean, I can share. I think that was a great presentation. From the site contracts and payment things I've seen, it looks very, very similar. I was baffled when I first learned about sites getting paid for like everything, like every single little action they take, whether it's like the nurse gets trained on the protocol, they get paid for that. The nurse gets trained on, the investigator brochure, they get paid for that. They identify a patient, not even like if the patient comes in or whatever, sometimes they get paid for that. Like,
is there any like, is the sponsor ever reimbursing the site, or is it the site's responsibility to make sure that its payment structure is kind of covering all those expenses?
So you can go for it, Hillary, but you're muted.
There's usually a pass-through cost, so if there anything else comes up, then they just go and they just bill and they say, oh, pass-through cost, that's this.
Yeah, a lot of the times I'm trying to think of a pass-through cost. There was a site that we had so for our protocol that the study we're working on, we want the site to have 2 EKG machines, and the site was like, we only have 1, but we really like the site, so we basically said like, buy another EKG machine and just run it through his pass-through cost. And that's like, it's not on the contract as like a billable event, but some things like that, they can be approved as pass-through costs.
Yep. And then like we mentioned here, like there's like different startup costs. And so this is kind of a cool, I just Googled this and pulled this up right before the meeting.
Oh, that's good.
So I thought it was so I can send this link out too. I thought it was a good kind of overview of like just different ones. And honestly, I've been on small companies where they'd be like, hey, do you have any old budgets or any sample budgets? Or like, I wish I had something like this, where they'd be like, we just want to know if we're getting like what should be around our amount, like what's a good example. Here's record storage fees, and then it's interesting here, there's screen failures, and here they've limited it to 8. I guess if it says if more, bill for additional, but I have seen things where they really want to avoid screen failures, so they might pay less for future ones, because realistically you shouldn't be doing a lot of screen failures. So they might be like, okay, we'll pay for the first 8, but then after that it's only $100 per, because you don't want to have them throw in random patients and then not they're just not screening their patients correctly. Yeah, it's a good idea of like, like $3,000 for like IRB, like,
and if they have a local IRB, you're paying for that as well. So, and
then when you like the site, like if you do a visit, the site's going to charge you, and then and usually if there's like an amendment, they'll charge you. So they'll definitely try to charge you at every opportunity. But yeah, no, thanks everybody. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out, send me an email. I'll send out the slides and this video recording and a link to the study tracker, and maybe the link to Vivo too. Jesse, do you have any questions? Or Logan?
No questions, but thank you so much for your time and doing this presentation. It was really great.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then
Yep.
have you submitted your application, Jesse?
I did, yes. I submitted that
Good,
to
good,
an
good.
hour.
And
Good
then
Jesse, go ahead, Nick.
I was gonna say, and then Max, Kayla, I haven't met you before, but nice to meet you. If we do have internships in my company, let me know what you're kind of looking for, and I can kind of like peek around and see what there is. But yeah.
Cool, good. And that's part of the point of Power Work, is that we all stick together and support each other as we continue to grow in our careers, and continue to look out for each other, because definitely internal referrals usually get looked at a lot more than anything else. Yeah.
Fingers crossed, I have my promotional bid on the 15th. So
Good. Okay, we will all send
we'll see.
good vibes and prayers and
luck,
your way.
Nick.
Okay, the 15th. Okay, right after Valentine's Day. What a
Yeah,
what a
exactly.
wonderful.
Yeah, good luck, Nick, and good luck, Jesse.
Thank you.
And yeah, thanks Hillary, and I guess Nick for helping as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and then let me
Awesome.
know your other topics too. If you're like Nick, if you know of, you get your CTA responsibilities for the senior, and there's other things that you're less familiar with.
I got one for you already.
Okay, cool.
What to know what's reportable and not reportable to the IRB.
Okay, cool. Let's I'm gonna write that down, and we'll
Yeah.
go through that. I'm also getting ready for an inspection filing, and so I'm like trying to brush up on everything,
Yeah.
and so I definitely want to do multiple rounds of inspection prep. So coming your way soon.
I was
Okay.
about to ask for that, because I've had so many interviewees ask me about my experience with inspections, and I've just managed to always miss inspections
Yeah.
at every company I worked for. So definitely I'm curious to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to be running the inspection. So I
Oof.
volunteered to be. It's funny because my boss is like, inspections are things that I'm very curious about, but never want to experience firsthand. And I was like, really? I'm like excited, but I was like, thanks for the encouragement. I'm like, okay, Dan. He's really great. I like my boss a lot. But yeah, so I volunteered for this, and I'm really excited, and hopefully sounds like we'll be delayed. So I will prep everybody, then go out on my maternity leave, and then come back, and then we'll do inspections. So
Nice.
but yeah, so I will firsthand know everything, sit there with the inspector, and I'm really looking forward to it. So but I'm definitely beefing up on all my stuff. So I'll share any knowledge with you guys. Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great night.
Okay, thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.